The United States is principally interested in containing China. I don't think that most Americans understand it's not China's fault that it wants to be powerful.
Will it lead to a hot war?
You have a security competition taking place. It's an intense security competition, a zero-sum game.
Nice to meet you, Professor.
As tensions between the U.S. and China ramp up ahead of the U.S. elections, we sat down for an exclusive interview with prominent realist scholar Professor John Mearsheimer, referred by the Chinese translator of his book, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, Professor Wang Yue, during his visit to Beijing. Mearsheimer has been a vocal proponent of the U.S. strategy to contain China. What is the endgame between China and the U.S.? After meeting with younger generations in China, could his views be shifting?
You have spent some time in Beijing and interacted with many of the younger generation of the Chinese people. Have any interaction like this caused you to refine your views about China or China-US relations?
Not at all. I have a simple theory about how the world works, and I believe that that theory has a lot of explanatory power. The United States is principally interested in containing China. I think the United States fears the fact that China is becoming more powerful and that it is not a status quo power in East Asia. The problem that the Americans face today is that they can't concentrate on containing China because the United States is deeply involved in the Ukraine war, and it's deeply involved in the various wars that Israel is fighting in the Middle East. But nevertheless, the United States is committed to containing China. And of course, from a Chinese point of view, this is unacceptable. And I fully understand that. From China's point of view, China wants to grow more and more powerful. But again, this is not in the American interest. So it is a fierce competition. And as best I can tell, this is a competition that will last for many decades, if not the rest of the 21st century.
The U.S. often framed the competition between China and U.S. as authoritarianism versus democracy. But in practice, the U.S. doesn't seem to care about democracy.
It's not about ideology. There's no question about this. Look, the United States and China got along very well from 1991 to roughly 2017. The United States, in fact, pursued a policy of engagement toward China. There were very good relations between the two countries. What's changed is not the ideological nature of China or the United States. What's changed is there is now a shift in the balance of power. China is much more powerful. So the move away from a cooperative arrangement to a more competitive, and in fact an intensely competitive relationship, is not explained by ideology, it's explained by a shift in the balance of power. However, it is very important to understand that both the Americans and the Chinese like to use ideological rhetoric to justify their position. In the American case, what American elites say is that this is a competition between liberal democracy on one side and authoritarianism or communism on the other side. This is all designed to make the Chinese look like the bad guys and the Americans look like the good guys. This is the velvet glove over the mailed fist in the American case. If you come to China, what people like to talk about is Confucianism and the Chinese tradition of not fighting with their neighbors and facilitating harmony in the international system and so forth and so on. This is very similar to what the Americans do.
But Chinese people believe it's not about how we talk about ourselves, but also about we have a good record as a peaceful country, like the Asian tributary system, like the ancient Admiral Zheng whose voyages into the South China Sea to the East Africa. So we believe we have a good record, and how could we reconcile this with your theory?
Well, you can't reconcile that with my theory. And I believe if you look at Chinese history closely, you see that China has behaved according to the dictates of power politics. The fact is, you don't survive in the international system if you don't worry about the balance of power. Because in the international system, there are states that are highly aggressive and dangerous. And you have to be powerful to protect yourself.
The Biden administration is trying to cap China's access to advanced AI chips, but that said, are these curbs too little, too late?
NVIDIA's CFO warning that China sales will drop significantly in the fourth quarter.
The Biden administration is trying to cap China's access to advanced...
The US has placed some restrictions on China's semiconductors and high technologies, and they believe it's one of the best ways to contain China. How effective do you think these strategies are?
I've long believed that the United States cannot do much at this point in time to slow down Chinese economic growth, and especially to slow down the development of sophisticated or cutting-edge technologies like semiconductors. There's no question that the United States is determined to now slow down Chinese economic growth. I think that might have been possible in the 1990s. It might have been possible in the early 2000s, but that didn't happen, and it's too late now. And I would bet that the Chinese overcome the American effort to damage the Chinese economy more than the American economy is damaged as a result of these, sanctions and tariffs and what have you.
So you think it's actually pushing the China to develop its own technology, and it might backfire on the US companies and global tech industry?
I think that's likely, yes. I think with regard to semiconductors, there's no question that in the short term the United States can hurt China. But I think over the long term, given the large number of brilliant engineers and scientists in China, and given Chinese history of developing sophisticated technologies in recent decades, there's every reason, in my opinion, to think the Chinese will rise to the occasion and they will develop a very sophisticated semiconductor industry. It may take a bit of time, but I think it will happen. And again, just too late for the United States to really slow down Chinese economic growth.
But to compete with China, should the US also be focusing on more developing itself, like the infrastructure, like its internal problem, rather than come up with strategies to contain China?
Well, those things go together. You want to do both. The United States definitely has to contain China. And if the United States could slow down China's ability to develop sophisticated technologies, it should do that. I mean, what you want to think about here is that you have a security competition taking place between the United States and China. It's an intense security competition. It has a military dimension, but it also has an economic dimension. And that economic dimension mainly involves sophisticated technologies. And that will continue for the foreseeable future.
Will it lead to a hot war?
I would make 2 points. Number one, it is possible that the security competition will lead to a hot war. However, it is, I think, likely that you will not have a hot war. You want to remember that during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, when you had an intense security competition, we did not have a hot war, thankfully, and we certainly don't want a hot war between the United States and China. And I would bet a lot of money that moving forward, there will be a number of crises, serious crises between the United States and China. And that's when the possibility of a hot war will be present. And my guess is that in those cases, the leadership in Beijing and the leadership in Washington will go to great lengths to try to prevent a war. Will they succeed? Probably. But I'm choosing my words carefully here. Probably. And the main reason I think they are likely to succeed is the presence of nuclear weapons. You're talking about great powers that are armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons. And if China and the United States get into a war, nobody can be sure what the escalation will look like.
the current China-US relations are quite tense, and politicians in both countries use strong rhetoric. Are you worried this war rhetoric could end up being a self-fulfilling prophecy?
What you expect is that the leaders at the top, who are, and we're talking about the leaders in Beijing and the leaders in Washington, who are responsible for the security of their country, who are responsible for the survival of their country, will behave in a cold and calculating way in a crisis because they understand the dangers. I think there are three big flashpoints, maybe four. One is Taiwan. As you know, China wants Taiwan back, and the Americans don't want China to get Taiwan back. So that's a big flashpoint. The South China Sea is a second flashpoint, and I think that's the most likely place where you will have trouble. Third area is the East China Sea, and there the Japanese are involved over these very tiny islands. And then the fourth area, which is not to be underestimated, is the Korean Peninsula, because the United States is deeply committed to South Korea, and China is committed to North Korea.
Some would argue South China Sea now is much more dangerous than Taiwan because it has no ready mechanism to manage conflict there.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that if you look at the military balance at this point in time, and for the next, let's say, 10 years, it's unlikely that China will try to conquer Taiwan. And of course, there is always the possibility that a Taiwanese leader will declare independence, which I think would probably trigger a war. But the Americans fully understand that. And the Americans will go to great lengths to tell the Taiwanese, I hope, that no Taiwanese leader can declare independence, because we don't want a war over Taiwan, for sure. The South China Sea is a very different matter. China has disputes with countries like the Philippines that could easily lead to a shooting conflict. And as you know, the Americans have a treaty commitment to come to the aid of the Philippines. So the Americans could get dragged into a war or a shooting match between the Philippines and China. So you could tell other stories about how trouble breaks out in the South China Sea as well.
Many Chinese people would argue if U.S. stopped provoking China in these places near China, it will be a much more peaceful situation.
Well, many Americans would argue that if the Chinese would stop provoking the Americans and China's neighbors, that we could all live peacefully. And this is exactly what you would expect. You have a security competition taking place.
And also some understanding gap.
Well, there's an understanding gap of sorts. I don't think that most Americans understand that it's not China's fault that it wants to be powerful. China has a deep-seated interest, as I said before, in making sure that it never suffers another century of national humiliation. And there's only one way to do that, and that's to be really powerful. Because if you're not powerful, other countries in the system will take advantage of you. And I think most Chinese don't understand that from an American point of view, the Americans should not want China to dominate Asia. Right? You should want to dominate Asia. China should want to dominate Asia the way we dominate the Western Hemisphere. So what that means is that you have this intense security competition where both sides are trying to take advantage of the other. This is the nature of security competition in a world where there's no higher authority and where states therefore have to worry greatly about the balance of power, and they have to maximize their power.
The world is also faced with many global crises like the climate change. If without cooperation between China and US, how will this work out?
Look, it's very important to understand that there are a number of issues on which China and the United States have an incentive to cooperate. Climate is one of them. Nuclear proliferation is another one. So I don't disagree with that at all. But the key point you want to keep in mind is that that cooperation takes place under the shadow of an intense security competition. Cooperation can take place, but again, cooperation is always subordinated to competition.
Military superiority might lead to some short-term winning, but what accounts for long-term winning, like what's happening in Middle East right now? Israel is winning wars in the Middle East, but it also mires in the situation because it will lead to prolonged conflicts. So what accounts for real winning?
I think that it is in China's interest to grow more and more powerful. And I think the way to do that is to grow economically. It's to develop sophisticated technologies. It's to become the #1 country in the world in terms of producing cutting-edge technologies and to have the biggest economy on the planet. That's what China should do. And I agree with what you're saying that it is not in China's interest to get into the business of fighting wars, especially against the United States. It's in China's interest to become more powerful. And again, the best way to do that is to grow economically. So I basically agree with what you're saying.
But it also works for the US, right?
Absolutely. The two building blocks of military power, what really matter, are #1, population size, and #2, wealth. You want to have a lot of people, and you want to have a wealthy country. You want to be really rich.
So do you believe in win-win? Because Chinese people like to talk about win-win.
No. In the security competition between the United States and China, I don't believe in win-win. I think it's a zero-sum game. And people didn't want that, and I understand. But my argument is that it's inevitable because of the structure of the international system.
Yeah. What advice would you give to the younger generations who hope to improve the relations?
Well, I think that you want to understand the nature of the conflict, and you want to do everything you can to keep a cap on nationalism, anti-Americanism in China. And I think in the American case, the same thing is true. The rhetoric does not get too hot. American nationalism and anti-China rhetoric doesn't become too powerful. It's very hard to prevent that, though.
There have been some cases in the history where the rising power don't end up with a conflict with dominant power. Maybe we can look at the history and find some wisdoms from history to
Well, you find those cases, and the next time I come back, you can interview me and we'll talk about them, okay?
Yeah, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.